What's happening, Sales Ascender? Sean here, back at you with another high-ticket tune-up for today. It is Tuesday. I hope you're having a wonderful week so far. I'm hoping that all of your sales dreams are coming true and your business is growing like wildfire. But in this video, I got a question from Andre asking about storytelling in high-ticket sales. And so what I'm going to share with you is the one thing that I have used in my career that really helps when it comes to storytelling in high ticket sales. Stay tuned. Yo, what's happening, Sales Center? Sean here, back at you with another high ticket tune up. Make sure and smash that like button, feed those algorithm gods so that more people can get more good at sales. That's right. Today's video, we're covering a topic that I think a lot of people know is truth, right? Stories sell, don't tell, stories sell, right? Share stories. So how do we use storytelling in high ticket sales? Well, there's quite a number of ways to do this, but I think that the secret is the one, and again, I'm going to cover the one storytelling secret in high ticket sales that has proven true for me and that will also prove true for you. So Andre asked a question. He said this, he said, Sean, I have never seemed to consistently tell the same stories in my sales calls, and I always mess up my stories. Is there any tips? And fact in case in point, the one tip that I would share with you to always do, Andre, is this. Remember the timeline of your story, right? Let me say that again. Remember the timeline of your story. Why is this so important? Because your prospect has never heard your story before, and you're the only one that can actually mess up your story if you're telling it incorrectly. And I see a lot of people when they start their sales careers telling stories in sales calls, and they get to this place where they're like, well, let me tell you my story, and they go into this thing, and the timeline of the story's off. They'll jump from kind of the start of the story all the way to the end, and then they'll go back and say, well, hold on, remember this part, and then this part, and this, and then they go back and they jump forward and back and forth and forth. Well, when you're writing a blog or you're doing some sort of a written post or on Facebook or even any of the other channels, what happens is in writing, you can see the timeline. You as the reader can go jump back and forth and back and forth, but in a sales conversation, you can't. So what becomes totally valuable is understanding the timeline of your story. Remember where you're starting and what the end point was, and what's the one or the two things that you need to convey in that story for your prospect to have an epiphany. And then we just stay focused on that type of story, right? And so when you start your story, even if you mess up, like if your entry point to your story is here and somehow you enter telling the story here, don't go back and cover this part. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. The timeline of the conversation has moved on. The only part of the timeline that matters in a conversation is here and now. You're listening to words out of my voice, right? Versus you reading a blog, you can read a paragraph and then backtrack up and go and forward and so on and so on and so forth. So in a sales conversation, it becomes important to make sure that we have the timelines dialed in. So when you start your story, don't ever go back in time. Just keep going along this path. Stay focused on the one or the 2 points. Typically don't do more than 3 points in the story. And here's a pro tip, right? When you're telling stories in sales, listen first, right? Don't just dive into, hey, let me tell you how I got here and what I'm all about. That doesn't make any sense. What makes a lot of sense is to ask your prospect a bunch of questions about where they're stuck, what problems they're having. And oh, by the way, guess what? You're talking about them. So they're having a great time telling. Everyone likes to talk about themselves. Let them talk about themselves. Totally okay and awesome. But here's where we get to. As you hear the problem from the prospect, a couple of things are going to surface. Number one, you've probably experienced that problem somewhere in the timeline of your story. So if your story, so let me just move this thing out of the way. So if your timeline is here and you know that the thing that you heard, the pain point from your client started kind of here in your story and you have to go just this way to get to the end, well, guess what? You don't need to tell all this piece over here. You can leave that part out. And so one of the tips that I share with all the members and the students that I teach is think about what's relevant to that prospect to get the point out of the story that you have. See, like I have a lot of entry stories. If I have somebody that I'm just speaking with that's just started selling, well, then I'm going to go back to the beginning of my story and I'm going to talk about how bad I actually sucked when I first started at sales, because I really did. And they can probably be like, oh my God, like you're resonating with me. I actually am not very good at sales. And it's okay, right? And so we justify failures. Again, if you haven't read Warren Blair's one sentence persuasion, just go to Google and type up Warren Blair one sentence persuasion and look for the PDF. There's a 13-page PDF that will actually share the 5 different persuasion elements that Warren Blair suggests. One of them is justifying failure. And so in that particular instance, when I'm talking to somebody who's not the best at sales, or maybe just getting started in their career, I'm going to resonate there in that part of my story. I'm going to hang there for a little bit longer. I can extend that part of the story if I want. But then let's say I'm talking to not somebody that's new, but rather somebody who has an agency that's been running for 15 years and they already know how to sell and they already understand the prospect and they've probably tried all this other stuff and had a lot of failure like I did. Well, I know what's relevant to that person isn't going to be how bad I used to suck at sales when I first started. I'll usually hint over that part of my timeline, and then I'll dive into this place where I said, well, look, we did this test and we tested all these methods of getting traffic to a webinar, to a challenge, to a summit, to, the direct outreach methods, to the organic posting, all this other stuff. In fact, we raced and we had this bet. Let me share how the story went. And I dive deep into the story that how we tested all of these different methods of traffic. Now that to that agency owner is going to be very, very valuable. And it's a little story that I can share with them and it's relevant, right? And so again, I'm remembering the timeline of my story is this is the whole timeline. And in between on the timelines, there's going to be little relevant bits of the story that I can share with my prospect. And so that's the one thing, again, going back to the one thing about storytelling is just remember the timeline of your story, where it started, where it ended, and then the person that you're speaking with, the prospect, where are they on your timeline? And then dive into that part of your story, share 1 or 2 good tips, and then move on, right? And that's really the secret when it comes to storytelling in high ticket sales. And with that said, my friends, you've just been tuned up. I hope this one has helped you. Make sure and smash that like button, share this out to as many people that could use this knowledge, feed the algorithm god so more people see this content. And don't forget, please subscribe to the channel. There's a sales ascender inside of each and every one of you. And I'm looking forward to seeing you tomorrow.